which is entitled "The Role of the European Union Funding in Supporting DI Around the World, a Call for Change." And so I'm very happy to have everybody here today. It's a webinar that was meant to happen a few weeks ago, but we had to report it because of the war in Ukraine. And then our team's been very busy with that, understandably. So I'm gonna go on Roberta, if you can just put the rule. So we have some rules to make sure that, here we go, we have them. So to make sure this webinar is running smoothly, I wanted to let you know that first we have international sign interpretation available, thanks to Razak and Gerdinand, who are interpreters today. We also have real-time captioning in English, and Heather is there. So if you want to read the subtitles, you can just open the link in the chat box. And then if you can, we will very much appreciate it if you keep your cameras and microphone off when you're not speaking. For any questions, when it comes to content or technical question, please use the chat box. And finally, the meeting is being recorded. So I hope you are okay with that. Roberta, can I have the next slide, please? Yes, thank you very much. So today I'm very delighted to have with us the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disability, Mr. Gerard Quinn, who's gonna do the opening of our webinar on disinstitutionalization. And it's really, really a pleasure to have you among us and to hear about your work on that topic. And the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Marianne, and good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor and a pleasure to make some opening remarks at the launch of this joint report. We live in a time when knowledge is highly industrialized and the mountain of publications is very hard to keep up with. The paradox is that mostly these publications are left unread. But now and again, there comes a study that opens up whole new fields of inquiry and that leaves the reader thirsting for more. So it is with this report. One can tell that this report marks the beginning of something extremely significant. Why? It isn't just because of its commendable clarity. First of all, I think it poses a moral question in a field long dominated by technocratic considerations. Recall that one of the more fundamental pivots in the UN Disability Treaty is toward human personhood, self-realization in the community with others. Recall the centrality of home in the UN Disability Treaty, your own home that both reflects and holds who you are and that positions you to grow in community with others. How then can we calibrate external funding instruments to make sure they do their bit to advance these goals of living independently and being included in the community worldwide? At a bare minimum, how do we ensure the funds do no wrong? This report expertly draws together disparate funding streams and asks a deceptively simple question. To what extent are they configured to achieve these goals? And do they in fact do so? So the tangled web of external instruments is meant to come alive in light of the overarching questions posed. In the process, the report has done a great service by itemizing and clarifying the underlying purposes of the various funding streams. The report is an ideal platform to invite in other researchers who can pursue the underlying goals of the research even more searchingly, and I'm absolutely sure they will. Secondly, and by clear implication, it challenges the EU with a deceptively simple question. Is segregation into institutions a form of discrimination or not? The word segregation itself appears over a dozen times in the report. It's one thing to insist, as the UN Crpd committee does time and time again, that such segregation is discrimination. It's another thing entirely to reflect this in the underlying funding instruments and to only fund projects that self-consciously aim to end such segregation and put in place the needed ecosystem of social supports to enable flourishing in the community. One gets the very clear impression from the report that there is still a level of ambivalence about this, either in the regulations underpinning the funds or in practice. Otherwise, why make grants to improve the quality of life in institutions? Greater clarity, moral and legal, is needed on this core point, and the report's recommendation about the need for fresh guidance is very well taken. Maybe, and just maybe, this ambivalence in the external funds is a pale reflection of ambivalence in internal EU funding policies, which may have greater clarity on the point, but which are not yet implemented in a way that's fully in accordance with the UN Disability Treaty. Third, the list of recommendations in the report are all tailored to breathe life into EU's external funding instruments, taking into account the UN Disability Treaty. Even if we didn't have Article 32 calling for inclusive development assistance, nor Article 11 on humanitarian emergencies, we would always have Article 4.1c that calls for the mainstreaming of the UN Disability Treaty in all laws and policies, which by definition includes foreign relations and external funding instruments. Might I just add that this opens up a dimension that warrants further and closer study. To what extent does the UN Disability Treaty have extraterritorial effects? Put bluntly, if the EU funds institutionalization in country X, and even if it hands over the management of the funds completely to country X, to what extent does it remain liable, or at least accountable, for the misapplication of funds in country X? The US Supreme Court has opined on this topic, but only from the perspective of the extraterritorial effect of its own domestic anti-discrimination law. It's only a matter of time before advanced jurisprudence emerges on this from the UN CRPD committee. So in sum, I feel that today marks an important turning point. And I hope and expect that new knowledge will emerge that helps us identify the gap between norm and practice, and that helps us close the gap with DPOs and CSOs as co-producers of change. The new EU disability strategy is rightly effusive about the role of the EU in the world. Through its external funding streams, the EU has a unique opportunity to act as a good global citizen. I think this report sets a very positive agenda for change, and I'm quite sure it is just the beginning of the conversation. Thank you very much, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Quinn. And now I actually would like to pass the floor to Ines. So Ines Rulik, who is the Deputy Director of the European Network on Independent Living, NE. And so if I give you a little bit of background about this report, is that at EDF, we've been working on DI for a while now, focusing on what's happening within the EU. But thanks to the project that we had called VVT, and then maybe Roberta, if you could put the link in the chat box. We work with partner in humanitarian action to also, realize that we need to do more when it comes to DI outside the EU. And then that's where we were in touch with Ines and decided that maybe this is something that we can do to look at what the EU is doing, the funding they give to the country that are not in the EU, outside the EU, and how is it going, really? As simple as that. So Ines, you're going to explain it much more better than me, like the whole report with the recommendation and the finding. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much, Ines.
Thank you, Marian. Let me just pull up my screen, which will, there we go. This is it. Share. Let's go to the first slide. Okay, thank you, Marian, and hi again, everyone. And just to say thank you to Gerard for his really nice words about the report. It's always good to get some encouragement and obviously positive feedback. So yes, I'm going to introduce to you, tell you a little bit about the report, of course, in the hope that you might read the whole publication. As we have limited time here today, and would like to, obviously to have a discussion about the report. So Marian has kindly already introduced to you a little bit of the context, but I would like to add a couple of details about why we also at ENIL thought that this would be an important thing to work on, and why we actually not approached but replied to EDF's call for a researcher on this report. As you might know, we still have really a large number of people around the world who live in institutions. By this we mean large institutions, social care institutions, psychiatric institutions, but also smaller institutions such as group homes, family type centers for children. There is a need really to do something about it. In terms of the data is very limited. We know that there are between 5 and 6 million children around the world still living in institutions. But for example, we have no data for adults with disabilities. Of course, there are many countries around the world where we don't have so many institutions, but where there's other barriers to independent living. There's no community-based services, no community-based infrastructure, no accessible housing, or no housing at all. So people might be isolated within their families, and basically lacking the right support to live included in the community. Then the other factor, which is of course very important and very interesting, is that the European Union is the biggest humanitarian and development donor in the world. So there is a lot of potential here for the EU to drive this change, to lead this change by putting the money in the right places. So that's a very, of course, that's a very important thing to know. Then when the European Union was first reviewed by the CRPD committee in 2015, because of course the European Union is also very interesting in that it had ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as the only regional organization in the world. So when it was first reviewed in 2015, the committee recommended that development funding must not perpetuate segregation and must be reallocated for independent living. And of course, we wanted to check if that has been happening. This year, just last month, the CRPD committee started the second review of the European Union. And we wanted to provide to the committee some fresh information as to how the EU was doing globally when it comes to implementation of the convention, right? How it was implementing the convention in its external action. And finally, we also have the new EU disability rights strategy, which has a chapter on basically the EU's role globally. We thought this report could also provide some useful recommendations for that in terms of what is needed to move forward. Then, of course, as Gerard pointed out, actually, there is very little research on this topic. We should say there is no research. There's no research at all on this topic. There is some research on the use of development funding and humanitarian aid in terms of protection on the rights of persons with disabilities and implementation of the convention, but there is no specific research on the role of the EU or on the institutionalization. And finally, we have these emerging and continuing crises. We had the COVID-19 pandemic, which had affected very badly people living in institutions. And now, of course, we have the war in Ukraine, which again is affecting very badly people in institutions. And we'll hear a little bit about that from one of the speakers. So there is a real impetus to know more, to know how to do better, and to push the EU, but also its member states to invest more and better in deinstitutionalization. So with the report, we set out to answer two questions. And the first question is, to what extent has the EU supported the closure of institutions and the development of community-based services in line with Article 19 of the Convention? This is, of course, the article on living independently and being included in the community. And is there any evidence that EU funding contributed to maintaining the system of institutional care through renovating or building institutions, for example? And we looked at the period from 2014 to 2020, which is the past programming period. And I should say that our research was really a small piece of research, only from July until about November last year. So again, as Gerard said, it's really a starting point, and hopefully there will be more. Now, how did we collect information? Again, I think it's important to know. So of course, we did some desktop research, knowing that there would be quite little out there already. We did a survey in 5 languages aimed at mainly DPOs to find out how much do they know about EU funding, whether they've had any experience of EU funding in relation to the institutionalization. I should say we had a very poor response to that. We used this facility that the European Commission makes available to NGOs or citizens, which is to ask for information under the so-called freedom of information requests. So we did 6 of these to try to get information from the European Commission and the European External Action Service with specific information, details of the projects aimed at supporting deinstitutionalization. We also filed one appeal. This was in case where the European Commission refused to release information about a specific deinstitutionalization project in North Macedonia, and which was successful. We managed to get some information after that appeal. We had 2 focus groups with DPOs and NGOs, one in the Western Balkans and the other in the other neighboring countries. And I should say these were probably the most useful exercise of all. We got a lot of information about deinstitutionalization projects funded by the EU, what was working well, but mainly also what wasn't. And some of the colleagues who actually took part in these focus groups are with us today. And we did some interviews, both with the European Commission, some development organizations, again, to try to compensate for the lack of basically written information. I should say that, yes, the main limitation was the very limited access to information. So even the information we managed to get about the project was very limited, very basic, incomplete as well, because we managed to sort of, we managed to find other projects which we were not sent by the European Commission. So it is very difficult to find information, and basically one would have to go project by project and to try to find out details through internet, through contacts, through field research, which we were not, of course, able to do for this report. I maybe just to add also, we did try to have somebody from the European Commission at today's meeting, but unfortunately they were not responsive for whatever reason. Of course, it would be important to have them around the table and to listen to what we found. So the key finding, that's the most interesting bit, of course. And here, just a couple of points. So the main finding really is that there are not so many projects funded by the EU which are focused specifically on deinstitutionalization. There is funding out there going for projects that may improve the situation of persons with disabilities through employment initiatives, maybe initiatives aimed at women with disabilities, may be aimed at improving access to assistive technology, to, I don't know, basic hygiene. You know, there are various, there's projects aimed at disabled people who find themselves in refugee camps, so in humanitarian situations. But when it comes to deinstitutionalization, so closing institutions and finding and developing services and support services for people to live in the community, and all that is involved around that, there is very little out there. Then the second point, when there are deinstitutionalization projects, deinstitutionalization is still understood as moving both children and adults with disabilities from large into smaller institutions. And unfortunately, this is really obvious. So, and this answers the question of, is the EU funding perpetuating segregation? And we can say yes, because even if we didn't find evidence maybe of large institutions being built, the fact that the institutionalization leads to trans-institutionalization of both children and adults in smaller types of institutional facilities is segregation per se is wrong. This is the main problem. Then the other findings, which are all linked up in a way, is that the contracts for projects aimed at institutionalization, where they exist, are awarded to beneficiaries with lack of expertise on DI. So these are various consultancies, all sorts of organizations which have no prior expertise or knowledge on deinstitutionalization. They're not in a country where you might have an organization who has been working for years on deinstitutionalization. They will typically not get this contract. And we are talking here about multi-million euro contracts in some cases. The contracts will go typically to, you know, a larger kind of nondescript consultancies who do everything from road building to social inclusion. So that is the problem. And of course, then they get outside experts to do the actual work. And it ends up, yes, creating services which, as one of the respondents in the focus group said, do more harm than good. So even when money is invested, it may be causing harm rather than good. Then we have the failure by international organizations to ensure CRPD compliance. And this has to do with the fact that typically the European Union prioritizes international organizations such as UNICEF, for example, and UNDP for funding, right? So they have priority in some countries or in many countries when it comes to development funding. And they will be in charge of implementing DI projects as well. But even they will not always ensure that the services developed are in line with CRPD. For example, they may also develop group homes for children with disabilities instead of making sure that children are placed with families. Then we have the lack of sustainability of newly developed services. So projects end, services end. In this worst case scenario, people go back to institutions or lose personal assistance, for example, that was piloted as part of an EU-funded scheme. So there is a failure of the countries receiving funding to take ownership of the new services and to guarantee continued funding for these projects and services. As I mentioned, it's very difficult to access comprehensive information, if not impossible. And there is a general lack of involvement of disabled people's organizations in programming, implementation, and monitoring of EU funds. Maybe just to add a little bit of a caveat here, of course, not all disabled people's organizations either understand how to, how to do deinstitutionalization, how to support people to live independently. But then here again, capacity building and just training and information sharing is also needed to make sure that they do properly understand the requirements of the convention. And finally, what do we recommend? So of course, we need that there is a need for significantly more investment in supporting deinstitutionalization reforms around the world. We need some clear guidance and criteria on how to do deinstitutionalization that complies with the convention. And these these criteria, of course, have to be built into all project applications, calls for proposals, calls for tender, so that there is no room or vagueness in what is allowed for funding, right? It should be very clear. It shouldn't depend on who gets the money. It should really be clear what sort of services, what types of housing are compliant with the CRPD and may be funded. We need an intersectional approach, understanding that some people, for example, women and girls with disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, people with psychosocial disabilities, with high support needs, children, may face additional barriers and may need a different approach. We need much more transparency in EU funding for external action. It's a very complex area. Even for somebody who is very interested in funding, I should say, it's very hard to understand. And it should be much more easier and transparent, both for NGOs, but also for policymakers, for just regular citizens to understand where this money is going. We need a better monitoring, and we need indicators that will be able to keep track of where the funding goes, supports independent living and supports real deinstitutionalization. At the moment, we do have the OECD, the so-called disability DAC marker, which can follow whether the funding supports persons with disabilities, right? But it doesn't specifically show whether it's preventing segregation or whether it's contributing to desegregation of services for disabled people. So we need something much more specific, much more focused. We need full involvement of persons with disabilities and their organizations. We need the European Union to reconsider the role of international organizations They need to be working much more closely with people on the ground, with disabled people, with DPOs. They also need to really guarantee full CRPD compliance in their work, especially as they are most often UN agencies. So we need also UN's internal disability rights strategy and the institutionalization strategy to be respected throughout the organization. We need much more research on the topic, so we actually know what is going on. Because this is just providing a little glimpse. And we need better accountability when it comes to the use of EU funding worldwide. At the moment, even if you find out that something is going wrong, there isn't that much you can do, to be honest. There is no, internally at the EU level, we have, an anti-fraud office, and there's various means you can actually report that funding is going into the wrong places. But globally, there isn't really such a thing. So this is all from me. Of course, as I said, I would encourage you to read the full report, which I understand has been or will be posted in the chat, and very much look forward to the discussion today. So over to you, Marianne. And the slide has now.
Thank you so much, Ines. And it's just so interesting. And I think, I've been very involved with my colleagues at EDF, in what's happening with Ukraine. And then what we realize is a place where it's the highest number of institutions, one of the highest number of institutions in the world. And I think what you've been preparing, it's just so meaningful. We have put some links directly in the chat box of the full report. So we also have an easy to read version. Please have a look. But what I was hoping, if that's okay, I'm going to give the floor directly to 2-3 people who put some question in the chat box, because I think it'd be nicer than just me reading the question. So the first question, if I'm not mistaken, is Tom Griffith. And Tom, if you hear me, is that possible for you to turn on your camera or at least your mic and tell us your question, please?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
I don't need to elaborate on this question in the light of the war in the Ukraine. All I can ask is, how has this report been extended to take into circumstances of the war in Ukraine on neighbouring countries? You mentioned the high rates of institutional care there, the huge barriers facing disabled Ukrainian refugees getting out of Ukraine, the threats of human trafficking, and the fact that the priorities in this report seem to have little consequence when you're dealing with a war and 10 million refugees.
Do you want me to take that, Marianne, or? Yeah. Well, thank you, Tom, for the question. I guess the first thing to say is that the report was finished before the conflict, before this war on Ukraine started. In fact, when we were going to first launch the report, those were the first days of the war in Ukraine. But I think maybe to answer your question, we did look at humanitarian aid as well. And humanitarian aid, of course, is different from development aid. So, for example, when speaking to the European Commission officials responsible for humanitarian aid, the first thing they said is, we have nothing really to tell you, on this topic, because our funding, so this humanitarian funding, is not meant to support, structural reforms or deinstitutionalization. We are dealing with emergency situations here, and that's nothing to do with deinstitutionalization. So we did point out that even in emergency situations, you can prevent situations which may cause harm or which may lead to institutionalization, even for those, for example, even for children who used to live with families. But it hasn't really been, the topic hasn't really been at all discussed or thought through in the humanitarian context. And I think you can see it now as well on the example of Ukraine, that there hasn't really been any thinking beforehand about what to do with people in institutions if a situation like this arises, where they have to leave quickly, or where they're essentially stuck there. But I think Dragana, who's on the panel, will talk a little bit more about this. So I wouldn't go, I wouldn't go into any more detail. Yeah, so maybe this starts answering your question, but I think Dragana can complete later.
Yes, Tom, thank you for your question. And then yeah, it's totally true. So at EDF, we've been working very actively on getting ourselves organized around Ukraine, meaning that we're working with DPOs in Ukraine and also in the neighboring countries. So for instance, when it comes to child protection, when it comes to institution, we are been sending a number of letters to the EU, with another one coming up, going to be sent in a day or two to ERA, I don't know how you say it in English, ERA, which is the new health agency focusing on humanitarian needs, etc., because we heard that they want to airlift children in institution. But as we know, some children who've been spending their life, or some adults who've been spending their life, in bed, who've never been outside an institution, you cannot just leave the countries just like that and expect that it's going to be easy. So we're going to have a letter that's going to be sent today with a number of recommendations. Next week, we're also going to have a new kind of policy paper about a very clear recommendation regarding children in institution in Ukraine. We just also hired someone, a disability expert, human rights expert from Ukraine, extra. So we have a number of things going on, but I know also Dragana is going to talk more about Ukraine in a minute. Now, I see the next question is from Endor. Are you there, Endor? Endor Urmos? If you can turn on your mic, please, and your camera.
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. Maybe I will not turn on the camera, just
That's
simply
okay.
because my line is not really stable, so I'm not sure that actually how much I will lose the connection at all.
It's okay.
Thank you very much. I try to be very brief. And Ines, thanks very much for the great presentation. I was just wondering how much actually your research has found some, let's say, the other parts of the coin, like community-based services, personal assistance. How much you found actually that this is also in the agenda, and can you tell us actually a little bit that let's say the focus more on institutional settings, and it means that actually they are not really focusing on community-based services. So it means this is a kind of strict separation of these investments, or there is a mixed picture. And also actually the question is how much have you been able to look at the policy frameworks? Let's say how much actually these countries or external countries, they have something which help actually to understand what they are doing actually in DI, and how much is it compatible with the UNCRPD? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. That, as I said, we didn't look at, it was a limited piece of work, but I can say that from looking at basically what we received from the European Commission were the names of the projects, right? And so as you know, sometimes it's very difficult to actually understand from the title of the project what the project exactly is about. Most projects still seem to be focused on employment, getting persons with disabilities into employment through various initiatives. But for example, beekeeping seem to be also among the popular ones. I know from one of the colleagues who took part in our Western Balkans focus group, for example, that they are receiving a sub-grant, because a lot of these projects also, for example, in the Western Balkans, a lot of them go to Caritas, for example, then Caritas will subcontract DPOs to do smaller projects. So I know, for example, one of the projects in Western Balkans is done this way through DPOs, where they do pilot some really small personal assistance pilots. So it's possible that, but again, we were not able to, we did not have time to go into every project because it's kind of impossible. Well, the way to do it would be to contact the implementing organization and then to, to get more information from them, because what is available online is very little. So we didn't really have, we were not really able to look into details. For sure, some of the projects go, I think, into piloting some community-based services. In terms of institutional settings, and this is what I mentioned, the way the institutionalization projects seem to work is that the institution is one of the implementing partners, and the staff who works in the institution is being retrained to then provide assistance to disabled people in these new services, which are most often small group homes. And this is not what at ENIL we would consider at all personal assistance, because it's not a one-on-one personalized service. It's a group home with so and so many people, and then the staff supporting them at once. So yeah, we did focus more on what was going wrong, but it would be possible and it would be interesting to go into more detail on all these projects, but you would literally need to do, as I said, either field work or reach out to all the implementing organizations and try to get more information from them, because it doesn't exist. And we didn't really look at kind of policy frameworks nationally. We were looking at more at what is there at the EU level in terms of policies and legislation that supports and guidelines, etc., that already supports the institutionalization or would need to be changed to better prevent segregation. So that's it. Over to you, Marian.
Thank you very much, Ines. So in terms of timing, I'm going to give the floor to Giampiero, and then after that, we'll have a 5 minutes break just to help with the interpretation. And then we're going to go to the discussion with the wonderful speakers that we have. So Giampiero, is it okay to turn on your camera or at least your mic?
Okay, I am here, but my camera don't run, so I speak.
It's okay. We hear you well.
Okay, you listen me.
Yes.
I wish to stress two issues that can be interesting for this debate. In the last year, the international system to collect information on the international cooperation, the OCSEDAC is the name, is a form to collect information in different areas of the funding addressed to the country by the Agency for International Cooperation, introduce a marker on disability. It's a new issue that happened 2 years ago, and the European Union upset to be included in this marker in the activity that the European Union financed. I think it's possible now to begin to identify what is the project that the European Union financed in the field of disability, and to know exactly with a specific research, because the OCSEDAC marker is very limited information, collect very limited information, but it's possible to developing a research on this field to understanding not only the issue ENIL support, but in the same time all the activity that the European Union use to financing activity to support the right of persons with disability or to support the application of the convention. The second point, for a question that I listened about the personal assistant, is very complicated in the country outside of Europe and no rich country to identify a system of welfare. But I can share with you an experience that the network, Italian Network on Disability and Development, I am the chair of that include the different 2 organizations of persons with disability, 3 organizations of international cooperation, have a building up in Gaza City, a center for independent living. That the person that managed this center is a person with disability, expert in the peer counselor, and this center is intitulated to Rita Barbuto, that working to building up this center, that you know is an expert of peer counseling and independent living fighters, and at the same time is an international expert on the woman that died 2 months ago. I think it's a good experience. Maybe if some people are interested, I can share all the information.
Thank you so much, Giampiero. Ines, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, just to thank also Giampiero. It would actually be quite interesting to know about this independent living center, but I can contact Giampiero separately. I think he's right. I agree on the DAC, on this OECD DAC marker. It could be a good basis for research, but yes, it doesn't. Also, it is optional to use, which also makes it a little bit tricky. But what we were trying to say that it doesn't really help us understand whether the projects contribute to desegregation or prevent segregation. So, but it could be a good starting point, certainly, and it's useful. I'm not saying it's not useful, but we need something more to identify more specifically what type of projects are being funded. So that's all I would add.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure they're actually using every DJ of the commission, and of course they're quite general, so to try to see if it's related to segregation, disinstitutionalization, etc., would be a bit. But anyway, Ines, thank you so much for the presentation of the report. You all have the links in the chat box, and then I see we have a message from Emma who said thank you. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to ask you, we're going to take 4 minutes break. So coming for me is meaning we're coming back at 55. And then we're going to start the discussion with the speakers. I hope that's okay with you. See you in 4 minutes.
Marion, I'm sorry, are you muted?
Yes, I'm speaking to myself, sorry. Oh, okay, thank you. We all back. And is it possible to have that slide where we'll see the next, the speakers? Thank you. And then, yeah, here we go. That's fantastic. So, with us now for the discussion, we have Dwi Aryani, who's the regional head of program for Asia at Disability Rights Fund. Then we have Ketevan Komeriki from the Center for Independent Living in Georgia. We also have Georgi Zeladze, and I'm sorry for my pronunciation, also from the Center for Independent Living in Georgia. We have Dragana Sirik Milovanovic, the Europe Regional Director for Disability Rights International. And then we have George Manik, so a Marie Curie Research Fellow from the Disability Advocacy Research in Europe, so the DARE project that maybe some of you have heard. So for the sake of time, I reorganized a little bit in my head that discussion. And if that's okay, if all the speakers here could turn on their camera, it'd be really nice to see you, if it's possible. Here we go, Dragana, Dwi, and then George. And then our friends from Georgia, if you can turn on your camera. And then what I was, there we go, Ketevan, and there we go. Well, I wanted to, there we go, we have everybody now. So I wanted to ask you if someone wants to take the floor and then maybe reflect on the finding of that report. And if the finding, if really they match your experience in this field, for instance, or would you have anything to add? And I don't know if someone, I see Ketevan, you unmuted yourself. Does that mean you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I can comment on this because several things we identified was interesting for Georgia as well, especially how funding goes towards independent living centers, so the institutionalization. And I would like to mention that within last 2 years, EU funding was unprecedentedly raised in Georgia. We never see such great amount of calls and grants we are distributed in Georgia. And it was interesting that last year, for example, two of the most big projects was funded by you. One received Coalition for Independent Living, and we are granted with our partner organization, who is a local DPO, actually, young local DPO from small part of Georgia, and it can somehow contribute to strengthen the local CILs, local DPOs. But these projects, we are not about the institutionalization or just independent living. Our project is, the aim of our project is to make a legal advocacy in rural areas in Georgia, make law cases, and as well to raise awareness about personal assistance services, about the institutionalization, and what does independent living mean. Another project was funded by you last year. It's very interesting because it was the first time as well that organization who works on disability issues received EU fund for development of social services. A huge research was conducted by European researchers to identify what type of services are needed in Georgia, and the respondents were persons with disabilities, and they were talking about what they need to increase their possibility to live independently. Because personal assistance term and concept of personal assistance was introduced only 2 years ago in Georgian law, information about what kind of service is a personal assistant is very low, thus people don't know yet how personal assistant service can contribute to their independent living. And because of this, home care was identified as a key service Georgian disabled people are needed in that moment. However, personal assistance was mentioned as well among activists, disabled activists, because they are well aware about this service. For now, after conducting this research, organization is with the Ministry of Healthcare is trying to develop standards of personal assistance and how it should be introduced in Georgia, how much money it can develop allocate to this service, and what will be the indicators who will receive and for how many hours they will receive it. Another thing what was interesting for me, it was about Caritas, what Caritas is doing in Balkan states, because Caritas is very active right now in Georgia. Caritas of Georgia is drafting right now the institutionalization strategy for 2022 for 2030. So funding is from Czech Caritas, but Czech Caritas allocated this money to Georgian Caritas, and they are drafting the institutionalization strategy with the Ministry of Healthcare and Social Care. And the aim, alongside with carrying out this strategy, is to establish 4 or 6 group homes, where maximum 7 people will be allocated, maximum, but they are saying it will be for 4 or 6 persons. We don't know yet. However, it's not enough, as in Georgia we have 3 large residential facilities, and on each facilities there are 65-70 persons. We have as well 10 community-based facilities, approximately 200 beneficiaries overall in these community-based facilities. So without more funding from government or maybe external donors, it will be impossible to maintain this strategy or action plan. It is also interesting that Caritas as well providing for several years home care services in Georgia. Czech Caritas is funding again. They are allocating to Caritas Georgia this money, and then Caritas Georgia with the Ministry of Healthcare is carrying this activity. Another interesting.
Ketevan,
yeah.
I'm sorry, am I going to have to interrupt you there to just give the floor to our other speaker? If that's okay. That's actually very interesting, and I was wondering if maybe other colleagues here, Dwi or George, I see you unmuted yourself, George, so I take it as a cue that you're ready to speak next.
Yes, thank you, Mariam. Well, I just wanted to highlight two of the points that Inez raised on the report. I am currently conducting research as part of the DER project on inclusion and participation of persons with disabilities in development cooperation programs, and I'm looking specifically to the programs that are funded by EU in the domain of gender-based violence and social protection in Mozambique. So it's not specifically about the institutionalization. I'm focused on these 2 specific areas, but many of the findings that Inez brought on the report resonates very much with what I'm seeing. My research still progressing, but some of the emerging findings resonates a lot with what Marion just mentioned here. And I just want to focus on two of those. So one has to do with something she said, which is related with lack of indicators on the institutionalization. And I will generalize that. It's about lack of indicators on disability, I mean, in general. So how a specific problem that you want to address, either it's related with gender-based violence, it's related with social protection, inclusion of persons with disability in social protection programs. How those problems impact specifically on persons with disabilities, women and girls, and children with disabilities, and how the solutions you propose also speaks with the issues that affect this particular group. So you don't find that discussion and projects that EU is funding in these particular domains that I'm looking at, which is gender-based violence and social protection. So the result of that is that you don't have activities and you don't have indicators and you don't have budget. And then comes also the issues of data. I think she also raised that in the beginning. So it's to me, it seems that it points to a larger problem in terms of program design, and also the ability of those who decide about, giving out funding to those projects have to assess those projects. So what are they looking when they do a disability assessment of those projects specifically, so I think it points to lack of quality or assessment of those projects, but also it points to the fact with something that she also raised, which is lack of research on disability in general, because we will only be able to reflect on different problems, either the institutionalization, either gender-based violence, social protection, if you have research done on these issues, and we don't have research on many of these fields. So it's explained kind of why you don't have that rationale in there, because there's no research on disability. So it's something that we have to, EU have to deliberately set aside money to support research on disability. That seemed to be clear to me. So the other thing I wanted to also focus in the lack of involvement of persons with disabilities, and and it's also in the report that many of the fundings goes to this large international organization. Marion, I see that my internet is stable, so I will cut my video to make sure that you guys are able to hear me. So what I was saying is that the second thing is related with involvement of persons with disabilities, and it's something that came out on the report as well, that many of the projects are implemented by large organizations, UN agencies, international NGOs, which is not a problem in itself, but it's a problem when that happens at the detriment of local and small organizations. And this is something that I'm seeing from the data that's coming out. So one of the projects, which is a Spotlight Initiative, which is a global project that I'm looking at, it's implemented by UN agencies, and they did subcontracting to local civil society organizations. But there's no, among those civil society organizations, a single organization of persons with disabilities or women with disabilities, since the program is about gender-based violence. So there's no any organization of women and girls with disabilities as part of the implementing consortium. And I mean, that's problematic, because it's a lot of expertise that you miss out, and also it points to the fact that there's no good understanding of the dynamics of the civil society in country, and the DPO movement as well, because you by understanding of the dynamic of the civil society, you will also understanding that the disability movement is quite separated from the larger mainstream civil society organization. And to engage those organizations, we have to have specific strategies to reach out to those groups, you know, and not just assuming that by contracting civil society organization, you may, you know, also engage organizations of persons with disabilities. And I'm saying this because these projects, they have a specific explicit commitment to leave no one behind, which means they have to make a deliberate effort to include not only organizations of persons with disabilities, but other marginalized groups, indigenous groups, you know, sexual minorities, etc., etc. So I'm focused on disability here because my research is about disability, but there are also problems when it comes to these other groups. So I will stop here for now.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think it's very clear that we need to make sure that organizations of persons with disability need to be involved, need to be consulted, if we really want to have this expertise, but also making sure that the CRPD is also respected and implemented in the way it should be. I'm going to give the floor to Dwi, and then Dragana, if that's okay, we'll finish with you. And I know you also touch both on Ukraine.
Thank you, Marian.
Thank you, George. Sorry. Thank you, Dwi.
Thank you, Marian, and thank you, everyone. Yeah, I think I would like to also highlight one recommendations that mentioned by Ines in the report on full participation of persons with disability and their representative organizations. Reflecting what we have done as an organization in our organization, Disability Rights Fund and Disability Rights Advocacy Funds, when we directly working with OPDs, Organization of Persons with Disability, on DI process. And actually, they are the ones that make the decision on what kind of project that they would like to do. And because we believe that they are the one that understand the context and what happened in their countries when it's come to DI. And one example that I would like to share is what we have in Indonesia when we work together with organization that represent persons with psychosocial disability, the Indonesia Association of Mental Health, that they're working to ensure that DI is also see as agenda with the disability right movement. So it's a priority agenda with the disability right movement, but also they try to reframing the issue also that DI is also should see as a human right issue. So they work with other civil society that working on human right issue, but also working with women right movement. As we know in the institution, women with disability face gender-based violence. And we also know that gender equality and gender-based violence have been one of the issues that have a lot of donor attention on that, but it's really a limited funding or resources provided when it's come to DI or the institutions, and what happened to that woman that living in the institutions, and what kind of support services or maybe community-based services that can support them when they are leaving the institutions. This kind of work is still missing, I think, in some of funding that provide toward gender equality or gender-based violence. Other things I would like to highlight also that we in the discussion before we mentioned about humanitarian actions and that a lot of funding goes to the humanitarian actions. I think coming from the global south countries where we really affected by natural disaster, for instance, it's very important also that DI should be included in any project or program related to humanitarian actions, emergency response. There's need to be included DI in that project and programs. So I think it's important also that EU fundings that involve a lot of humanitarian actor should also have a discussion with OPD on how that DI also be included in that program and projects. And the other things that I would like to share also that it's also important to see how that systematic approach can be done on DI and how to support a DI process. We work with OPDs, but also we need to see that there is also important to increase the capacity of OPD, but also how that they can engage in legal reforms and review all the law regulations that affect DIs. And I know that there's not much funding goes to that kind of work for OPDs to see amendment, to do amendment of law or advocate for law change. And so I think that's also something that we should support OPDs when it comes to DI, how that all the regulation at national or local levels can be reflected and can be reviewed and amendment so that DI also include in those regulations. Thank you, Marian.
Thank you very much, Dwi. And yeah, I think you make a very good point for our next speaker, Dragana. You know, and the fact that you mentioned DI must be included when it comes to humanitarian action response. And I know, Dragana, you're going to talk a little bit about Ukraine, because I think I was in Poland last week, and when I was talking to colleagues there, one of the worries is that they were saying, well, we've been working on DI, we had a strategy, but now it's all on hold. It's not happening anymore because people who are in institution in Ukraine are trying to be moved also in an institution, and so DI is just like totally forgotten that you know that approach, that strategy. So Dragana, I'm giving you the floor, and thank you, Dwi, for your wise recommendations.
Thank you very much, Marian. And indeed, the crisis in Ukraine, which is enormous, I must say, has implications throughout the region and not just people in Ukraine, as we see more and more people being moved to other countries as well. But I wanted to start first and to reflect on the situation and lack of investment and institutionalization, to try to understand why we are here and why we have hundreds of thousands of people trapped in institutions in Ukraine and now in neighboring countries, as well as they're being evacuated to institutions in neighboring countries, which are being even reopened because of this situation. So first time DRI warned about international investment post-conflict situation was with regard to Georgia after the conflict with Russia, and also we were doing our investigation during 2014 conflict in eastern Ukraine, and we warned about all the things that are now happening. We warned about the situation that people, children in institutions and adults with disabilities are facing in conflict zones. We warned about money being used to maintain and to refurbish institutions rather than to be used for reforms. So all this was already mentioned and already elaborated with, especially when it comes to international assistance. What I would like to emphasize is that very often deinstitutionalization starts from children without disabilities. It was a situation in Georgia. It became also a situation in Ukraine, where we have examples of trans-institutionalization. So even in this misled attempts to deinstitutionalize children, in this case, they are being transferred to small group homes, and that efforts
although misleading, are also totally excluding children and adults with disabilities. So even in these very limited attempts to deinstitutionalize or to implement deinstitutionalization reform in the country, it's mostly focusing on children without disabilities, or while children with disabilities are left behind. And that was really presented with very specific examples of investments which were going into institutions rather than developing services in the community for children with disabilities and their families, and also for adults with disabilities. What do we have now? I mean, in Ukraine, I can't even begin to describe. We have around 700 institutions for children. God knows how many more for adults. I wasn't able to find a figure. And also, we have more than 1,000 group homes. These are for children and with and without disabilities. We have no idea how many children and adults with disabilities there are. We have so much fragmented data because many institutions are under different jurisdictions in the country. We already have reports, confirmed reports by UNICEF and Save the Children, that children are missing, and that simply children who were evacuated from institutions went missing once they left the country. So according to the latest data I received, only about 28% of children are being registered at consular services once they leave the country. So I know we can talk about it probably much longer. Just wanted to focus on recommendations and maybe what can be the role of European Union and other donors in this situation. And as we are seeing the consequence of not investing in institutions, we also must be aware that any investment going into Ukraine and neighboring countries to support persons who are now refugees have to be mindful of consequences of investment into residential care. We have to be mindful to balance, the urgent response that's necessary to, save lives of people, but also we don't want money to go into maintaining segregated institutional settings that would make dismantling institutions impossible in the long term. So that's why what we mentioned is really important, that while dealing with humanitarian crisis and while directing humanitarian aid, we have to be mindful of the consequences that these funds, and these are really enormous funds that will be pouring in as humanitarian aid into Ukraine and later development aid, we have to be mindful what the consequence would be to maintain institutions and keep people segregated. So it's a really difficult balance to achieve. Now being very closely involved in the situation in Ukraine, where we are trying really to balance, what are the basic needs of people who are now trapped in areas where bombs are falling over their heads, where they cannot get basic necessities. What is the balance that, where this investment, where this support to institutions, how far can it go, and where must it stop to avoid any further strengthening of segregation of persons with disabilities?
Thank you so much, Dragana. I was wondering at this stage, I don't see any question in the chat box, but maybe we have time for 1 or 2 questions. If anybody, oh, I see Rados. Rados, if you want to just unmute yourself and maybe put your camera on.
Hi, everyone.
Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Marian. I just wanted to ask everyone, or maybe to share, that the EU Commission recently launched the tender, the call for research and consultancy services, because usually they hire external consultancy companies to provide them the long-term consultancies in different areas, including human rights and disability. And this is a 4-year contract, in my understanding, and those consultancy agencies are then expected to list the key experts, including the key experts on disabilities, which are the people designated to mainstream disability into their external action. So this particular tender is focused on external action and development. So this call is ongoing, and these consultancy agencies which are going to compete in this tender are looking for key experts on disabilities. So I think it's important that we try to identify people who would then understand CRPD in full and be able to mainstream the things that we are talking about today. So if that's helpful, I can share the link just so you know.
Yes, please. Yeah, put it in the chat box. Of course, that's very helpful.
What I'm talking about, but the thing is that civil society or NGOs are not allowed to compete in this call. So this call is for those consultancy agencies like NIRAS, GOPA, EPTISA. So it's good to talk with these agencies and to make sure that the right people are included in their roster, because then they're going to apply on this tender with the list of the key experts they're including.
Thank you, Rados. Thank you so much. I'm going to take one more question, and that would be from Cesar. Cesar Jimenez Sanchez, please. Thank you.
I think my questions are in Rachel Riaz's inbox. If she could check her email account, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so that's for you, Raquel.
Yeah.
Please check your emails.
I will, Cesar.
Thank you, Cesar.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm conscious of the time, so I think we're gonna stop the event, the webinar now. And I'm sorry for the speaker. I changed a little bit the format, but I wanted something a bit where we had a bit of a discussion and we could take the questions. And I think the conversation and the recommendation have been very interesting and very meaningful. I know that Ines and Dragana, they have in mind maybe some kind of event or webinar a little bit later related to Ukraine and institution. So I think maybe you could still watch this space, because there will be more coming about, about Ukraine, which is really one of the priority right now, at least at EDF and a number of organizations here. So at this stage, Ines, do you have anything you wanted to say before I close?
No, maybe just to thank everyone for taking part, and of course also thank everyone who contributed to the report, and some of the colleagues are here with their knowledge. I mean, I would just like to say also that not to let, I mean, the situation in Ukraine is really on everybody's minds, but there are so many people around the world also in institutions and in really difficult situations. So we must continue kind of to push for more and better investment everywhere. And like Dragana said, if somebody had listened to the recommendations some years ago, things might have been a bit better. But I would say let's continue this conversation. And of course, if there's anybody out there who would like to fund more research, let us know, and we can take an even more in-depth look into what is going on. But yeah, it was very nice to hear from everyone today, and let's continue the conversation. And thank you, Marianne, as well.
Well, you're welcome. So thank you, Ines, Gerard, our speakers. I also want to make sure I thank Gerdina and Razak, as well as Heather, and of course Raquel and Roberta, and Natalia and Michael. So I think I have got everybody there, and apology if I forgot someone. Thank you, everybody. Have a good end of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.